Welcome back, everyone. I want to introduce my next guest, Brian Trent, who is a science fiction, fantasy, and horror writer and has stories that have appeared in both Weird World War III, Weird World War IV, and is expected, another story he has, we expect is going to appear in Weird World War III China, which is my next anthology. He hasn't written it yet, so now he is fully committed. With that, Brian, I want you to introduce yourself. Where you're from, background of just kind of a brief biographical background, and then start talking about how you got into this writing fiction game.
With pleasure, and thanks for having me on, Sean. I really appreciate it. Well, I'm Brian Trent. I'm a Connecticut science fiction writer. Also write fantasy and horror and alternate history. It's another passion of mine. And I've been publishing professionally now for, I guess it's been about 10 years.
And what got you started?
I've been a lifelong sci-fi fan. I'm going to cut my teeth on Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, H.P. Lovecraft, and was banging out my earliest stories on a Brother 11 metallic blue typewriter. So I've always been a sci-fi writer. And just wasn't necessarily very good when I was younger. So
when did you start submitting? Like how old were you? Like when you sent your first?
Young. I mean, first it's probably about 9 or 10.
Oh wow.
So,
literally put a story in an envelope and send it.
Literally put a story in a big manila envelope and sent it off, and had a collection of rejection letters, of course. But I was reading the magazines back then. Actually, it was just cleaning out my closet, and I found some of the very issues of fantasy and science fiction that I had read or remember reading, as a kid. Going to bed and just plowing through one story after another, and what made me want to get involved in that. Plus, I grew up on all the great sci-fi classics: The Forbidden Planet, Them, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Incredible Shrinking Man. It was just that was my bread and butter. And definitely wanted to make my own contribution to the genre, since I knew how it inspired my worldview and what's possible, looking to the future, looking to what's beneath the surface of reality. So I love it. It's a great community to belong to. It's a great industry to be part of.
Now, you mentioned Arthur C. Clarke, H.P. Lovecraft, and someone else who's blanking.
Bradbury. Yeah,
Bradbury and Asimov. Would you consider those authors your influences, or is that a subset of greater number of other influences? Just like talk to me about that. Like who would you consider to be your influences in some of the writing that you've published thus far?
Well, I'd say, all four of those and others as well were big influences. But if I had to single out a few, I would say the three biggest ones for me were Ray Bradbury, because just no one does metaphors like that. No one does that style. It's so vivid and visceral. And then H.P. Lovecraft, because I like the cosmological perspective. I'm a Star Trek fan, like a lot of people, but I always got annoyed at the humanoid aliens. I always got annoyed. Everybody's pretty much at the same technological level, which is clearly not going to be the case. So I like the fact that he came along into an industry that was, flooded with vampires and flooded with a lot of tropes. And he introduced things that made you think way outside the box, right? And then the third author would have been H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is a big influence. The Island of Dr. Moreau is one of my top 10 favorite novels. And he was so innovative and wasn't afraid. I like Jules Verne as well, but what I like about Wells is he wasn't afraid to get into the dark underbelly of the genre. He's one of the first to do it. He was not an optimist. He was, maybe the forerunner of the grimdark subgenre. But you finish reading the Wells story and you come away shaken. Even The Time Machine, forget the movies. Right? The time when you finish reading The Time Machine, you come away with an almost Olaf Stapledon-like sense of inferiority in the universe, how fleeting life is, how fleeting a species is. Look at the grand scale of life on this planet, how how we have been around for only a blink, how civilization is a fraction of that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you're getting into, Zeno's paradox territory here. So it definitely, I like things that really challenge you, challenge your place in the universe, challenge your perspectives.
So like concepts of deep time,
Yeah.
a broad cosmological scale, those sorts of things.
Exactly. It's that, and I guess I do swim in those waters myself. I mean, not all of I write a lot of fiction, but there's definitely a subset of my stories that takes place in the very far future. And while it's not necessarily Olaf Stapleton territory, it leans in that direction. It's humanity.
So for folks who aren't familiar with Olaf Stapleton, you could say a little bit more about the sorts of, we have a sense of kind of the sorts of things he writes, but things that folks could check out to read more about him.
Sure. Well, I would say there's a number I can recommend, but my two recommendations would be, Last and First Men, which, they're dense books. They're a little tough for modern audiences in a lot of ways, but it's still interesting to dive into his imagination. It charts the evolution of humanity through 18 different species over several million years. And then he wrote Star Maker, which takes that entire timeline in the previous book and reduces it to a blip because he charts the evolution of life in the universe. Just nobody does that. Right. Especially for a kid,
It seems well, somewhat akin to like Tolkien a little bit, in terms of like spending all the time inventing all these languages and this really deep history, but different too. I see what you're saying. You're talking about like telescoping that sequence of events, right? Which is a little bit different.
I think that's a fair comparison. Tolkien and Lovecraft were both inspired by Lord Dunsany, who also invented lots of gods and his own cosmology. And I think there were those purveyors of that style. They're unique. It's definitely it's an acquired taste, but I think it's worthwhile jumping into.
Okay. In terms of some of the themes that you tend to write, what are the themes that you keep coming back to, and why?
I'm interested in technology's impact on society. I like, in fact, my World War III story introduced one specific technology into an alternate 1980, right? And then how would that change things, right? How would it change daily living? How would it change military strategy, et cetera? So in a lot of my stories, I do deal with certain technology, whether it's mind uploading, whether it's different types of mobility, tissue regeneration, whatever. And I also like the concept of, as we move out into the universe, we're not going to be terraforming planets. You're not going to justify the cost or the time. We're going to change ourselves to fit different environments. So in a way, those 18 different species of Olaf Stapleton are a sampler platter, right? The aliens of tomorrow will be ourselves. Will be a fractured humanity, as we spread out to a Galapagos of the stars. Evolution happens fastest in isolated populations, and assuming you can't surpass the light barrier, you're talking about a divergent evolution in a million different ways. So it's a little creepy, I suppose, in a way, but it's spreading humanity's seed out onto these different shores. You're going to be changed. So I do deal with that in a lot of my fiction. My war hero stories in particular get into that.
And war hero, to remind the audience of the first place that appeared. And
sure. Well, I wrote, actually, I've been building up to a novel, and my novel War Hero actually comes out later this year. It comes out in the autumn. But I've been writing a 10,000 Thunders. My book that's already out is also set in this universe. I created a time scale of the future. Sometimes some of the stories are 20 years from now. Some of the stories are 10,000 years from now, but they all connect in one way or another. And one story might mention, for instance, an alien species just on a list called the Cloud Kings. Just mention, the Cloud Kings of the planet Tempest in the Shakespeare system. And then several stories later, I'll have a story about the Cloud Kings on Tempest. That's actually Karma on the Cloud Kings was one of my published stories in analog. And other stories that appear in fantasy and science fiction, or Orson Scott Card's Intergalactic Medicine Show when that was around. So it gives me a broad canvas to kind of explore a lot of different things. And I like it. That we don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel. I mean, it's also, there's certain technology that I'll refer to again and again. Certain characters might be referenced. And I also feel really strongly that if you're going to do something like that, the story should stand on their own. I don't expect people to come to any one of these stories having read the other 30 ones. Just they should stand on their own. But if you read more of them, you're sort of inducted into that universe. And if you enjoy staying, great. So
there's actually, I mean, Lovecraft kind of did that. Yep. To some extent, right? You can read any one story, but he established a whole mythos that, a lot of other writers contributed to that. Like even to this day, right? You have John Langan, for instance, is in both anthologies, right? He's written a lot of contributed to a lot of Lovecraftian anthologies. Nick Mamatas is another one. Laird Barron, who's in Weird World War IV, or is a story in Weird World War IV as well. So it'll be interesting would you ever consider letting others play in your mythos or universe?
Absolutely. I would love to. And I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Lovecraft is one of the earliest people to do this, and he invited other people in, and the results were great. Robert E. Howard contributed to those series. C.L. Moore contributed. I mean, there was a lot of it was, and they're still contributing to this day. And yes, a lot of, not all my fiction, but I definitely have a little subset where I tend to look at extraterrestrials as being very different, if not necessarily great Cthulhu coming out of the ocean. Certainly things that don't have an earthly analog. I'm a little tired of the bugs in space or the hot green women tropes. So if we're going to run into something different, it's going to be really different. Like the space slugs and The Empire Strikes Back, or the John Carpenter's The Thing, or the Medusans in the episode of the original series of Star Trek. There's a lot of I like that, the Vorlons in Babylon 5. Mm-hmm. So but to answer your question, sure, I'd love to have other people contribute to the universe, because I love visiting over and over again. Now,
you more than most authors that I can think of off the top of my head, you have cracked, and this question is for writers, you have cracked some of the toughest markets to crack, from the magazine of fantasy and science fiction to analog to Clark's World to Strange Horizons to Apex to Nature, and not only you haven't done it just once, like you're doing it consistently, and you're also in a number of Bane anthologies. Again, I like you because I like your stories a lot, primarily the ones you've written for Weird World War III and Weird World War IV. But and I'll get to that too, because I want to talk about the genesis of your Weird World War III story in particular. But we'll get back to that. How are you able to consistently do that, and how long did you try? How long did it take to crack these markets? And do you have any advice for authors who just, no matter how many times they submit? And by the way, there is one publication you have not cracked yet.
Yes,
which is Asimov's, and we can get to that. I'd be curious to hear your theories on why not. But let's talk about what's working first. Because something's working extremely well and better than most others.
Oh, thanks. I suppose one thing is it sounds obvious, but if you want to be a writer, you have to write, right? Mm-hmm. It's very easy. I know a lot of writers who are always gearing up for a story. You gotta develop it as a habit. You really do. And when I sit down to write, that's what I'm doing. I'm not researching anything when I'm down to write. I love research, but when I'm sitting in front of the glacial whiteness of an open Microsoft Word document, that is not the time to do research. Your smartphone should be buried like the Ark at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark in a warehouse somewhere, away from you. You don't need any distractions. If you're writing, choose the time that works for you and then write. be productive in those hours. Because I've written a lot of stories. So half of the battle here is just having stories to send out to different places.
So how many stories have you written? Now here's the problem. I'm a data junkie. So
Okay.
like I could tell you exact numbers on my own process, but you know, I would say, like, how many stories roughly have you written in your lifetime? And then roughly what percentage have you been able to, you know, get, you know, because it could be exactly as you said. There's a lot of people who are just extraordinarily prolific. Ray Bradbury, I think, was one of them. He would write, what, a story a week, something like that. So you'd have 52 stories a year. And, you know, at some point, like, every story can't be your best, but if you write 52 stories a year, you're going to write something good. So again, to the extent that you can give folks kind of a feel for that sort of metric.
Yeah. Well, part of it is just being productive like that. And also I tend to write a lot of stories at once. Like they kind of grow, like groups of stories will grow up together. So I'll sit down on a Monday and I'll work on one story, and I might work on that same story on Tuesday, but on Wednesday I might start something else. So they slowly grow. And then when I really start feeling the inspiration for one in particular, or in my evenings when I'm doing research, I'll figure this research works for this story, and then I'll really focus on that one. Forget the other ones, but the other ones are started. You know, those fires are kindled. The coals are getting hot. So and also I tend to research when I'm really focusing in on a story and working towards completion. And I've already done the research now, and I can see the home stretch. On my off hours, I'll be researching the next story that I want to write from scratch or continue that's already started. So it's kind of like a juggling in a way, but
you're never bored. Yeah, you're never bored.
You're never bored, and
you're never stuck.
What's that?
And you're never stuck, right? If you're stuck in one story, you can just jump to the next one, right?
You're never stuck. I think it's a big thing. I kind of fell into that habit. And also they're very different from each other. You know, if I'm writing a hard sci-fi story, very nuts and bolts, science and technology, I'll be working on an alternate history on the other days, just to keep myself flexible and I don't burn out, I guess, that way. So that's one thing too. Then of course, and everybody's going to say this, but this is very true. Study the markets. You know, you don't. I have personally run into exceptions, but you generally want to send your nuts and bolts sci-fi stories to places that publish that kind of thing. You want to, you know, there's, whether it's cyberpunk, people have their likes, read the magazines, see what they like to publish. It's not a guaranteed roadmap, but it certainly gives you something to base your strategy on. You know, those are, and also I don't necessarily write in order. Like if I'll have a scene in mind, my stories begin with the setting 99 out of 100 times. So I'll just start the story. I don't worry about finding the perfect opening. You sit next to setting your computer on fire. I can't imagine a worse way to cut yourself off at the knees, but to try to be perfect from the word go. Just get the bones of the story down, polish it later, refine it, and don't send it off until you think it's perfect. But I don't get hung up on that. I try to write quickly. I try to write clean from the word go, but because I've been doing this a long time now. So I guess I'm kind of a literary madman. I do a lot of writing in front of the computer. So inevitably something is gonna break through.
Now, when you start, you know, when you have a blank page, now look, every story could be 100% different, or you might have certain patterns and that's what we're trying to figure out, right? Or at least that's what I'm trying to figure out for the audience. When you sit down, you're looking at a blank page. Have you done 10% of the research? Have you done 60% of the research? Or are you just, I'm going to write a story today and I have a random idea and I'm just going to write, and then I'm going to figure out the research after?
Depends on the time. And depends. And I'll give you an example. So one of my more popular stories was in fantasy and science fiction. It's called The Dog and the Ferryman. And that story, I had been reading some Greek mythology and reading about Charon, the ferryman. And I thought he'd be a cool character to write a story about, but I didn't know what I wanted to do, right? I just thought maybe he is in the future and people aren't dying anymore. Oh, there's an interesting idea, but I didn't know what to do it. Like, what does the ferryman do if people aren't dying? So I had no particular story in mind. It was just sort of percolating. I ended up going to a museum, the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut, and they had a exhibit on the history of cartoons, as it like political cartoons, in the newspapers. And they talked about the very first time that an anthropomorphic animal had ever been featured, something that's ubiquitous today, but back in the day, it had never been done before. And the first talking animal in a comic book was a dog. And those two separate ideas came together. I went home and I wrote the story like at a white heat, like in 4 days. So, that story, of course, is about Charon ends up meeting an uplifted dog in the future. It sounds weird, but I didn't see that coming. Other times, I just do a lot of reading. I love reading science journals, science papers. I like history. I read a lot of history. Actually informs my writing a lot. Again, maybe it's that Olaf Stapledon sense of his historical timeframes, but I'm always reading things and things that start to occur to me. Usually those irons in the fire have already been lit too, whether it's about uplifting animals, which is a subject I've dealt with a couple times, or about artificial intelligence. So usually I'm inspired by a lot of what I read.
Well, let's talk about that. So the sorts of things you read, generally, and, I don't think everybody agrees with this, but I think there's probably a consensus. If you're a writer, you should also read. But the question I would have is, what portion of what you read is fiction versus nonfiction? Because I think people don't read enough nonfiction, because that inspires more than you'd think.
I agree. And actually, when I was growing up, I read almost exclusively fiction, which I think was important to do to a writer developing. I think that's how people should start. But nowadays, it's probably 80% of my reading is nonfiction, just because I like to think I know how to tell a story now. So I like getting facts and data and different discoveries, different inventions, different candles in the dark of what's possible. Right? They're working on developing a quantum computer now. That's interesting, right? They're working on a universal a cancer vaccine, for example, universal coronavirus vaccine. That's interesting. How did that happen? What are they doing? What exactly are the nuts and bolts behind it? I don't have a story in mind. First of all, I just want to know it because it enriches my experience of the world.
Right.
But who knows? One of my story that's coming out next in the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction later this year came about partly because I had read, I wanted to write a story that was set at an archaeological dig site. I didn't know what they were digging up. I just knew I didn't want to be dinosaur bones because that's been done. So I had read about that. I talked to an archaeologist, and then it sat there for about 4 years in my head until other ideas came along, and you kind of dust it off. You look at it and see what fits. Tough to predict, but because I think it'd be cool. I think people should be. I think people are interested in their world anyway, right? I mean, right. Certainly kids are. Everybody knows kids who rattle off dinosaur names and who can pronounce Archaeopteryx and things like that, and that makes, as I said, enriches your experience in life. Just as a writer, you take it one step further. You write about it.
Now, talk a little bit about, actually, let's go back to the origin story of your weird World War III story. So, Brian's going to tell the world what happens when a writer flakes. Go.
This is, Sean, you had reached out to me through Facebook and said that asked me if I wanted to participate in an anthology for Baen Books, and you kind of needed an answer right away because I had 2 weeks to write the story. Because I guess there have been a number of writers who have been invited, and I guess one or two of them, didn't return in a story or wasn't let you know they weren't going to be turning in a story. So I said yes immediately. because I wanted very much to be part of the project. And then I looked at the calendar and started to sweat because, for the uninitiated, World War III is it's very specific parameters that you gave me too, right? It's
Yep.
Cold War. Stephen King's The Mist meets Red Storm Rising. Tom Clancy's.
That's right. Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising. Yep.
So I don't write stories set in the Cold War. My stories are, as I said, 20 years from now or 10,000 years from now. But I actually love those parameters. I like having parameters given to me like that because it forces you to be creative. And one of the wellsprings of creativity is to be out of your comfort zone, right? I didn't have a story I could dust off and send to you. So I had to think, what can I do here? And either we chatted for a couple of days, 2 weeks. I was very conscious that you wanted me to pitch the idea first in case I unintentionally wrote something similar to somebody else. So I threw a couple ideas at you. And
by the way, that never happens either. Like it never happens. And sometimes they'll be close enough, just in terms of the topic, but the stories will be completely different, right? So David Drake read a story about Cambodia, and his experiences obviously were resonant from that. But T.C. McCarthy also wrote a story in Cambodia, set in Cambodia, but they're very different stories. But I didn't put them next to each other. I just put one in the beginning, one toward the end, and it just works. But it rarely happens. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, continue with your thought.
No, it's okay. Well, it forced me to think of, all right, here's the assignment, and I've got now 12 days to do it. Let me think about what do I know about the subject? Well, I grew up during the latter portions of the Cold War. I remember the threat of nuclear war. I remember thinking as a kid, I might not grow up. Here in Connecticut, we had the Groton submarine base here. It was certainly on the hit list of the Soviet Union back in the day. So, and then you had movies like The Day After and Threads and Testament and By Dawn's Early Light. So
War Games, like all that. Right.
War Games, and you had Carl Sagan talking about it. It was hitting anywhere you looked. It was a real threat, and it impacts a generation. So I'd always been interested in that. I was always aware of it. And I like the espionage industry. I'm a big James Bond fan. I enjoy Tom Clancy. So I thought that there was a story I could think to tell. And this goes back a little bit to what you asked me before. When do you start your research? When you're facing the glacial whiteness of a page? I didn't have time to research anything with that one because I had to write the story. So what I did is I thought quickly, where I want the story to take place. I was going to 1980. I was going to set it in 1980, and it was a good decade for the Cold War.
Yep.
And I could get into East Germany, West Germany.
And by the way, there were fewer 1980 stories than I would have expected. Right.
Yeah, actually, I actually was shocked. I figured you were going to. I thought somebody else would have done that. So, but I came up with the technology, the speculative technology, which was an interdimensional toggle. There's two worlds side by side, and you can step one world to the next. But the terrain wouldn't always line up. So you have this researcher who lives on a houseboat on Lake Lucerne, Switzerland. And the reason he lives there is because he's afraid the Soviet agents are going to come get him. And he's on the boat. It's not just the lake that protects him. In the other dimension where the lake is, it's a 3,000-foot castle. So he figures he's safe. And so I came up with that idea, and then I set it in Switzerland. One is I had just been to Switzerland. I'd been to Lucerne like a year and a half before that. So it was fresh in my mind. I thought I could bring some authentic detail to it. But also it worked. Switzerland being neutral, a perfect buffer zone, perfect place for Soviet agents and NATO to be operating behind the scenes, and the CIA. So I had that, and I knew I wanted it to be a chase caper, the scientist getting abducted, and because he knows things about this other dimension that could help the Soviets. I started writing the chase, the dialogue, the visual, start with the setting like I usually do. And in the evenings, I was doing the research. researching different JSOC units, and I based Shadow Rooks roughly on the Navy SEALs, reading about the tactics, the strategies and tactics of a non-nuclear World War III. And this is interesting too. There's a lot of like declassified stuff out there that I just read out of interest and for part of the research.
Did you, as part of the research, did you happen to come across Relentless Strike?
The what?
It's a book called Relentless Strike.
I did not. No.
So if you ever want to write about this stuff again, definitely check out that book. It covers up to maybe 2016, probably 2010, because it takes a while to produce the book, but it goes into the evolution of JSOC over time. It talks about, it goes into Delta Force, what that looks like. It goes into the SEAL teams, but it also goes into SEAL Team 6 and how that's different than the others and why. Yeah. So it's really good. But anyway, that's an aside, but continue. Sorry.
For sure. No problem. There's a lot of, like I said, a lot of declassified plans that came to light, old Warsaw Pact plans, it did some of that reading, and I learned about the Fulda Gap and learned about that. And a lot of the stuff didn't even factor into the story. It's just I wanted to be able to step into the setting so I could tell the story that would work.
Again, as another aside, my old unit was the unit that was stationed on the Fulda Gap.
And that was interesting too. When I submitted the story to you, you mentioned that it was just fortuitous. So maybe.
Yeah. So I asked you to add, not only that, I asked you to add it. I asked, right. It's a little Easter egg.
Your regiment. Yeah.
And also David Drake was part of the same regiment in Vietnam.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, obviously, so actually that was serendipitous. So I was doing a lot of the reading at night and writing during the day. Cranked out a first draft in a week, and then did the polishing and sent it off to you. And I was very happy with the story, and it's not something that I would have written on my own. So, but you got to. It made me appreciate how much I enjoyed that decade in terms of espionage, in terms of geopolitics. So it was great. It was a great subject, but it wouldn't. I mean, 2 weeks is not ideal. I was sweating. I didn't get a lot of sleep that week. That's for sure. There's a lot of coffee.
What was it called? It was like Shadow Rook
Red.
Red. Okay, that's what I thought.
In my story, the Shadow Rooks were this fifth column. These interdimensional division
special forces, right?
Special forces that would operate again to counter the Soviets' interdimensional forces, and it changes so much. Plus, what I really liked, this happened just coincidentally, but because by the nature of two worlds and people being able to travel between them technologically, not magic, I was able to explain why people wouldn't be using nukes, right? You don't spend your nuclear payload on targets that might essentially be Potemkin villages, where all the important research, all the important personnel and ammunition and equipment has been just shunted over into a neighboring dimension. So, but yeah, I think I've talked to writers who feel like they don't like the constraints. And hey, to each their own. I love being essentially told, look, here's the deal: Cold War, non-nuclear, conventional war, and the 2 weeks lit a fire under me, and it was fun. So
I also particularly liked the ending. We don't need to discuss it here because it really embodied what the anthology was about. Right. Thank
you. Yeah. That was I won't spoil it, but I would encourage readers to check it out because it is it was a fun story to write. And I did try to hit the Tom Clancy and the Stephen King wellsprings. I definitely wanted to check those boxes. So,
now talk a little bit about Weird World War IV and your story there. Obviously, say a little bit less because you want folks to. I mean, folks should buy both anthologies because the stories are amazing and all of them, particularly your stories. But just a little hint about, I could say the premise a million times, but I think you say it. You're better salesman than I am. I like how you frame these things. So tell folks a little bit about the overarching concept of that anthology and then how your story fits into it.
So this is interesting too, and it was certainly a bold choice to do World War IV. I got to say, I remember being very surprised when you invited me, and you're like, "Well, we're gonna do 4." I had to, do a double take. But it was a contrast because World War III, conventional World War III, you've got a very very strictly defined borders of what you're going to be talking about and so forth. World War IV, it really forced. Speaking for myself, but I mean, some of the other writers too, from what I have seen with their posts, it really forced us to project ourselves into completely creative areas. I mean, it's the parameters are wide open now. The only thing we need is that World War III happened, and now there's World War IV. And here's the thing too: this is not the Einstein quote, right? I haven't read all the stories yet. I just got my complimentary copy the other day. But there may be some apocalyptic stories in there, but when I was thinking about it, I thought, okay, what do we do? So I didn't want to do a nuclear apocalypse. I thought, well,
and by the way, there were a few. They're just
okay.
They are wildly. One of them is actually a play. They're like, you want to talk about creative people really went hard on the creativity, and they're good too. But go ahead.
I can't wait. Yeah.
Oh no, continue with what you're saying.
I can't wait to read it because I want to see what other people did with this. But I know for me, I was asking myself, all right, so you got EMP driven wars where you set things backwards. You got interdimensional, interplanetary, which would be more of a world's war. There's so much you can do, right? And I knew, so I started thinking, what can I do with that kind of concept? And I looked back at the world wars we've had. And one thing I noticed about them is that World War I, World War II, they completely upended our concept of what war is. And we have, thousands of years of experience. And we've seen how technology will change things. And the Macedonian phalanx changed how war was fought. Invented by, essentially perfected by Philip of Macedon and used like a surgeon's tool by his son Alexander. You have the Chinese crossbow, the English longbow. You have the Roman corvus that allowed them to gain supremacy at sea when they didn't know the first thing about naval warfare. Those were isolated incidents, but with World War I, for instance, it changed everything. You have the introduction of flamethrowers and tanks and planes and chemical warfare. People walking around with gas masks like steampunk interpretation of plague doctors, trench and I thought, what was the difference here? It changed. All those elements converged to make it so that the commanders of the war, who had studied in the old school of combat that was relevant for a long time, didn't appreciate how things had changed. All the gumption in the world does not allow you to overcome German machine guns. And then, of course, World War II, you have its own set of changes that culminate in the detonation of atomic weaponry, something that had only occurred in mythology. So I thought, what can we do in World War IV? And I came up, instead of just coming up with new technology, there is that. I thought, what if World War IV challenges our place in the universe? And this circles back to our cosmological idea, right? Mm-hmm. Where we are invaded by a neighboring timeline, and it's not humans that invade. This is a timeline where dinosaurs continued evolving into sentience and went. Now think about this. Dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. Imagine if they had achieved a technological civilization, within 10 or 20 million years of that. You're talking about levels of technology that are indistinguishable from magic, as the quote goes, right? Mm-hmm. So we are reduced to like vermin. The opening line in the story says, this guy's riding a train that wasn't built for humans. And he's allowed to ride it in the way that rats are allowed to ride a seagoing ship. So it just changes everything. Humanity had already suffered World War III, and while they were down, they were invaded. I'm not going to say too much about it. It's not a standard invasion. It's not like that. I will say this: the invasion, they didn't even know we were here. They had their own situation. They invaded, and it's like, oh, mammals are in this time. How interesting, how cute, and move on with their situation.
Right.
So. Yeah. So, like you said, you have to be a little creative if you're looking forward to World War IV. So I don't know what I'm going to do for World War V if we ever do that.
I mean, I kind of like to go back. I mean, obviously, we're working on Weird World War III China. but I'd like to, if the series continues to be successful, I really want to go back and do like a Weird World War One and Weird World War Two. Now I did pitch those ideas, and for good reason, for very good reason. They're not. They were construed as not sufficiently differentiated, and I think that's fair. However, I would still love to do them. So for folks listening to this, like in the comments section, if you think that would be something you would buy, please start, commenting on it and asking for it. So I have some sort of data that I can bring back to the publisher and say, no, people will really buy this. I swear, we have evidence of it. But right now we're not there, and I completely understand where the
I'll second that, Sean. I would love to do a World War One story, a World War Two story. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, writers would love to do it. The question is like, will people buy it? I mean, I would buy the heck out of it, but
I would buy that story. I would buy that subject as well. Yes. So.
And for the same reason, I didn't go back and pitch like a weird war, weird Civil War, and you could do a lot of interesting things with that. But we'll see how it does. Now let's talk a little bit about some projects that you're working on now that you think will be pretty interesting for folks to check out.
If the first one would be, of course, my novel War Hero will be out. 10,000 Thunders is the prequel, but as I said earlier, you don't have to have read the prequel to enjoy this. It takes place, a couple decades after 10,000 Thunders. There are some characters that carry over, but you don't have to. If you haven't read the first one, read the first one. I wrote it as a sci-fi fan. I think that other sci-fi fans will enjoy it. But War Hero is a different kind of book. It's straight up military sci-fi. He moves the action to Mars, but it's a different kind of Mars. I think it's not the kind of Mars we've seen necessarily, because it's pretty far in the future. So that's my big project I'm excited about. And I'm also I just finished.
And when does that come out? That comes out later this year. Right?
It comes out this year.
Where can people find it? Where can people find it? And when does it come out?
Yeah, it'll be it'll be bookstores everywhere, but I haven't been given a firm release date yet. So it's probably going to be, I'm going to guess October. But yeah, you can check out my blog at briantrent.com or find me on Facebook, and I'll be giving updates and so forth. And I always post links to my stories that come out. But that'll have a countdown, and look forward to sharing that with readers a lot, because again, I like military history, and this is a military story set actually 1,000 years in the future. So it's with a lot of technology, and I think an adventure people will enjoy. And also, I was writing an alternate history. A story set in the alternate history was published in the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in the September-October issue of last year. The Scorpion and the Syrinx is one of the featured stories. So I'm continuing writing in that universe just to, again, keep myself on my toes, not always writing war hero stories. So here's something that's a history that never was, but could have been. Speculative fiction works in the other direction too. What if history, and that's what we did with World War III, right? So how could history have unfolded differently? And then I just continue with a lot of short fiction. It comes out pretty regularly. I'm fortunate enough to be able to say that, and just keep plugging away at different ideas, and life remains interesting. So there's always something interesting to research, read about, and write.
Now there's several Baen anthologies that are going to publish a story that you have coming up. So Weird World War IV, obviously that comes out on March. You can pre-order now anywhere books are sold. What other Baen anthologies are you going to appear in the near future?
So I was just in the John Ringo's Black Tide Rising. He invited me to the We Shall Rise anthology, which takes place after the zombie apocalypse, and it's about rebuilding civilization and the challenges that go along with that. The zombies are still there, but they're more of a background threat. This is about people, and that was a great experience research, because it actually was research to do there. It's not like you don't just hunt squirrels and call it a day. You have to grow the right kinds of crops. You have to network. It's it's evolutionary altruism. It's about working with your fellow humanity to restart civilization. So I wrote a story called Descent into the Underworld that takes place in Italy, and involves a individual, a guy who is living in Italy with his mother and his daughter. They've escaped the cities. All the big cities have, pretty much burned to the ground at this point. There's no firefighters anymore, right? The threats now aren't the zombies. The threats are a broken hand that won't heal. The threats are malnutrition, the pills that your mom needs. So, his daughter disappears. It's clear that she's been kidnapped by somebody. I won't say who, won't get into the details. And they kidnapped the wrong daughter because before the apocalypse happened, he was a professional hitman. It's working for freelancing for different organized crime units. So that was actually fun to write, and I was very honored to appear in that series. And I have a story coming out in Worlds Long Lost.
As do I, by the way.
As my table of contents mate here, absolutely. I'm looking forward to reading yours very much. I love that was that goes back to Lovecraft, right? So this is Lovecraft in space concepts like cosmological terror. So I wrote a story. I'm not going to say much about it at all at this point. I'll just say it's called Howlers in the Void, and I got the editor. I actually ended up delivering it on Halloween. I swear I did not do that deliberately. I was trying to get it out before November 1st to the editor. And he just wrote back to me and said, I see why you delivered this on Halloween. So
yeah, see, I gate crashed that one, actually. I had written a story that had part of the theme, but it was I shouldn't spoil it either. But I found out about it from another author, and I just messaged Chris, the editor. I think Sean is subsequently, he's also kind of editing it as well, Sean. I kind of basically from editor to editor, I said, hey, if any of those authors, if any of your authors flake and you need a story, I'm happy to submit something that you could use in case somebody falls out, right? It was less of the hard sell. It was just kind of like, if you have a problem, I'm more than happy to send something that I've just written that fits this almost perfectly. So he said, "Oh, just send it." He said, "Just send it." And in a few, like very, very quickly, he's like, "Yeah, it's a little bit different than the others, but I like to have one or two that are different but fit, just a different way." So that's how I got it. It was my first gate crash, I think.
Okay, and a successful one. But that's the joy of anthologies, I think, is what you said, that you have. I just love reading short stories as a kid. I mean, everything from The Illustrated Man to Arthur C. Clarke's anthologies, because you never really know one story to the next. You're going to get a wide variety of ideas, and when you have an anthology, a wide variety of voices, and that's the beauty of it. That's why I would love, I would encourage readers and listeners to this. Check out World War III. Check out World War IV. I mean, there's some. I haven't read World War IV yet. I just got it, like I said, on Friday. But World War III has got some. I'm delighted to be in that company. The stories are consistently interesting, and they're given a subject, mystical or preternatural, Cold War. Run with it, and people ran with it. So it's fun. And Worlds Long Lost. I'm looking forward to that because that's right up my alley. That's actually, that goes back to what we started talking about. That space is going to be creepy. If there are species out there, they're not going to be, Klingons with basically human beings with slightly odd craniums. And we're talking about really things that challenge what's possible, challenge basic biological processes, challenge your sense of what technology is feasible. So had a blast writing that as well. I actually haven't been given a release date on that. Do you know when that was supposed to come out?
I think it's December 6th. I think it's like literally in the last week. Okay. It hit Amazon. So December 6th of 2022. Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that. There's another one that I'm going to be in at Bain Anthology that comes out in June, which is that Stephen Lawson's piece, which is Robo Soldiers. and that's just former either military or intelligence veterans. For the most part, there's one or two exceptions, and the premise is, what does the future of like AI and robotics look like in warfare? And I came up with something that, again, the focus of that constraint really made me go wide with some stuff, and it's unfortunately I even invented a CRISPR virus that our adversaries could create today with existing technology. So it's pretty scary stuff.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's I look forward to hearing that. I look forward to reading that too. I mean, Bane's got great anthologies out there, so it's fun to participate and fun to read them. So
yeah, a lot of creativity.
And I was also in Cosmic Corsairs, which is about space pirates.
Okay,
it has a story in there as well. So which happens to be one of my war hero stories, set in the war hero universe. So yeah. So
is there a compilation? Is there a compilation on your website that has a list of all these stories in your war hero universe?
Yeah. So if you go to www.briantrent.com, go to my published works tab, and by year, all my published stories are listed there. If it's available without a paywall, I link right to it. There's a lot of stuff that's available for free, and there is right at the top of that. If you want to get that granular into some of the details, there is a list that is a page about where all the war hero stories and where they occur chronologically. Like one of my most popular stories is Sparg. It's about a little uplifted mollusk-like pet. It was in daily science fiction. That, for instance, is near future. But then again, you have stories like the war hero story, which is 1,000 years later. So there's a lot of different. You can see that list if you want to get into that.
All right, I'm going to ask you a little more of a controversial question, which I referred to earlier on, but I never got back to you.
Sure.
Analog, not analog, Asimov's, what's going on there? Why haven't, from the person who hasn't cracked any of the big three, why have you cracked that one particular market?
I'm sure it's not personal.
It never is, my friend. It never is.
I don't know. I haven't. I've sent a number of stories. When you find out, with a couple exceptions, when you find out what publications like, you can start to write stories for that, like with that style. Like, okay, I'm like with fantasy and science fiction. I mean, I have a pretty good idea of the kind of fiction you like. I read every issue that comes out. With Asimov's, I read every issue that comes out. I just don't quite know. I haven't quite hit it with them yet. So
what works for a magazine of fantasy and science fiction? If you were to, what works for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction? Like, what sorts of things would you send to them? Analog is pretty clear. It's like,
yeah, with fantasy and science fiction, I think strong narratives, strong plots. Elaborate, interesting plots with interesting characters. I know this sounds generic, but I mean that's just what it is. It's not so much that the technology can be there. I mean, again, they published a lot of my nuts and bolts science fiction as well, but just in really engaging story, really engaging plot lines, including. In fact, they published Crash Site, which won the Reader's Choice Award, which in 2019, I think, from Bain. And that story had 5 different plot lines that all wove together. They all converge into a big confrontation. But I'm talking about all these different characters who are just, 4 plot lines, 5 major characters that converge. So that's what I found to be kind of successful, there. But Asimov's, no, I'm not sure yet. But hope springs eternal, Sean. So
you'll do it. I mean, you've hit everything but that last one.
Yeah,
so eventually,
it's the white whale. It's a little bit of my Wimbledon, but I can't quite seem to can't seem to win.
Look,
So
I'd be happy. I'd be happy to crack one. I get the closest to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction,
yeah.
and I was never quite sure why, but your description of what they're looking for is where my strengths tend to be. I tend to be a strong plotter. I'm probably weaker on character, and I think Asimov is solving for very strong characters. I think more than I don't know. I don't want to overgeneralize, but that's been my when I read those magazines, those are sorts of where I see differentiation.
Yeah, and I think it is. It's tough to provide a thorough assessment, but I mean, and I would say too that I mean the editors over at Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction are just been wonderful, and they provide. I find great editors. They know what makes the story great, right? So like if they give you a suggestion, editorial suggestion, it usually cuts right to the heart of it. So I've had a couple suggestions thrown my way, like, we love the story, but, have you considered this? Or, maybe just change this a little bit, add a little of this. And then I tell a lot of aspiring writers, with a couple exceptions, there are some exceptions out there, but overwhelmingly, when an editor makes a suggestion, they know what they're talking about. And they know what they're talking about better than writers do most of the time. Right. So because they just see more stories, more variety, the nuts and bolts, the bones of it. Yeah,
and I'm always frequently surprised by what they like versus what I like. It's sometimes like there's a story I sold to Motherboard, right? The like Vice Media's story. That I was like,
the Terraform?
Really? Yeah.
The Terraform, right? Yeah.
I'm like, really? Oh, and it's a good story, but it was just I didn't feel like I had to work as hard on it as some of the other stories that I really like that aren't as successful. So there's I think I'm a better judge of others' work than I am of my own, but I try to figure it out.
I think a lot of us aren't great judges of our own work. I mean, I actually had a story there as well called Extinction Studies, and I had a similar experience as you. Just like, I was more bewildered, kind of had to read the email 3 times. It wasn't
even Terraform though. It was like Analog was just like, it's a little too short, but this is the kind of stuff we like. And then Clark's World said something about it. I'm like, what? Like, really?
You never know. I mean, that's all the more reason. Always keep. I think that's this is coming a little later after you asked it, but advice for writers. I think just make sure your stuff's out there. Just keep putting it out there. So it's always you send it to one place, it comes back, send it somewhere else, and just because you never really know what an editor's gonna like. You can get a general sense. You can start to read the terrain a little better, but seriously, you don't really know.
Speaking of which, let's end on this particular note. What would your advice be to some all sorts of writers, and it might be different. So starting writers, writers who've been at it for a while, who are still trying to break in. What would your general advice be?
Well, I would say, 3 R's. So basically, R in sound, not necessarily in spelling. Right. First and foremost, right. And I mean, seriously, like, when you're writing, remove the distraction. It deserves to be said twice. No one's going to read your hashtag 500 years from now, but we still read Sophocles and Sappho. Mm-hmm. So put aside, don't make, Facebook can wait, Twitter can wait, right. When you have the time, if it's in the morning, and find the time. We have busy lives, I get it. If it's weekends work for you, getting up a couple hours before work works for you. Rome wasn't built in a day. So if you can only write 1,000 words every other day, it's 1,000 words closer to completion. You'd be surprised how quickly you'll build up a body of work if you just make the time to write. Don't get distracted. And then the other R is, of course, read. In the beginning, as we were talking about, read fiction. Read fiction, definitely. Read the classics. Read modern fiction. Don't limit yourself. Just don't do that. And then determine what works for you. For me, it's nonfiction. Nowadays it's more nonfiction than fiction, but you have to study, you have to learn from the masters. You have to see what works and what doesn't. What made you feel a certain way? And when I first read Bradbury, it was like somebody, lit my synapses up with some of these images, like fire balloons. It took me to places it's tough to articulate, but I saw how he was articulating it, and I thought, I want to do that. I want to make people feel the way he made me feel with that story, with that universe. And then lastly, research, which again ties into the reading, but just keep yourself open to things. I mean, I think one of the reasons I've been fortunate enough to be published in a lot of places is because my interests are pretty diverse. I don't limit myself to one kind of reading, one subject. I like to make sure. I always do it on Facebook. I always do an end of year summary of what I've read, what I've learned, what I've watched, what I've written, etc. And I want to fill the time that I have here, in this life with learning how the word works and of course writing about it, researching anything from archaeological excavation sites to CRISPR, to nanotechnology, to the foods they used to cook in ancient Persia. I mean, why not, right?
Yep.
So I would say, read, write, research. That's important. And then, yeah.
Well, Brian, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Sean. This has been great.
I look forward to reading many more of your stories, hopefully in my anthologies, because you make them interesting. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you sent the invites. I'll keep writing.
All right, brother. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Yeah.